The first thing they noticed wasn't the barbed wire. It was the smell. Thick, smoky, almost sweet. The kind of smell that made the stomach turn over and growl in spite of fear. It drifted across the yard in lazy ribbons, carried by the morning air until it curled around the prisoners climbing down from the truck. One woman, her hair cropped ragged from weeks at sea, paused with one foot still on the metal step. The smell struck her so hard she almost laughed. She didn't. None of them did. They stood there blinking, squinting against the sun, their bodies stiff with fatigue, their uniforms clinging to their skin. For weeks they had been told what to expect. They had been told that capture meant humiliation, maybe death. They had been told to bite their tongues, guard every secret, never show weakness. And yet here they were, standing on American soil, being herded past a guard with a clipboard who looked less like a monster and more like a bored farmhand counting sheep. Beyond the gates, across a stretch of sand-colored yard, smoke rose from a low wooden building. And that smell, salty, sizzling, fat-rich, clung to them like a promise or a threat. The women moved in silence, 30 in all, their boots crunching on gravel. Among them was Yuki, a nurse barely 21, her hands still raw from treating wounded men in the Marianas. She had not slept properly since Saipan fell. She had been ready to die on the beach, grenade pinned between her fingers, when the order came to surrender. Now she walked stiffly, eyes fixed ahead, though the smell tugged at her memory of childhood markets where pork vendors fried thin strips to lure customers. The gates shut behind them with a clang, metal teeth locking them into this strange new world. To Yuki's left, an older woman muttered under her breath. It sounded like a prayer. To her right, a younger one swallowed hard, her face pale but her nose twitching like she was ashamed of noticing the food. The camp stretched out in neat geometry, rows of barracks painted army green, watchtowers like wooden crosses at each corner, and beyond them a sweep of pine trees dark against the brightening sky. It was all too clean, too orderly, like something from a propaganda reel. A guard gestured them toward the main building, his English clipped but not unkind. They filed inside, the air cooler here, and were handed cups of water. Real water, cold enough to sting their teeth. Yuki drank in 3 swallows and felt it run down her throat like glass. She had not expected such simple mercy. Then came the paperwork, names, birthplaces, ranks, family details. The clerk, a bespectacled sergeant, worked without hurry. He looked at them the way one might look at stray dogs, not cruel, just detached. When he finished, they were led toward the mess hall. And that was when the smell hit them at full force. It was louder than sound, heavier than memory. It curled around the rafters, wrapped itself in their hair. Yuki caught herself breathing through her mouth like a child, ashamed of how her body betrayed her. Her stomach growled, and one of the guards glanced over, not unkindly. Inside, long tables stretched end to end, already crowded with prisoners from earlier transports. Mostly men, some laughing quietly, some staring into space. Trays clattered, tin cups rang. And at the far end, cooks in white aprons stood behind steaming pans where dark, curling strips hissed in their own grease. Bacon. The word had no perfect twin in Japanese. To them it was simply meat, though this was no thin ration. The smell was fat, smoke, salt, the very opposite of the boiled millet they had eaten on the transport ship. A corporal handed Yuki a tray. On it he dropped a slice of bread, a pat of butter, a ladle of beans, and 3 strips of the sizzling meat. She stared at them as if they were an accusation. The butter glistened. The bacon crackled softly, its edges curled like smiles. She sat with the others at a table near the wall. No one spoke at first. The only sounds were chewing, the scrape of tin utensils. Then one of the younger girls giggled nervously, and it was like a spell broke. Quiet chatter rose, tentative but growing. Yuki took a bite, and the taste exploded, salt, smoke, fat, so rich it almost made her dizzy. The shock of pleasure gave way to something heavier. She thought of her younger brother in Nagano, probably gnawing at sweet potato vines, and of her mother who had begun skipping meals so the family could have more. She thought of the soldiers who had died on the beach only weeks ago, their stomachs empty, their bodies stiff in the sun. And here she was a prisoner, fed like a guest. After the meal they were led to their barracks, narrow but clean, with cots and wool blankets. Yuki sat on the edge of hers, fingers resting on her knees, trying to summon the dread she had carried for weeks. It wouldn't come. The fear had been replaced by something harder to name. A mixture of shame and reluctant gratitude, like tasting sweetness at a funeral. That night she could not sleep. The camp was quiet except for the occasional crunch of boots on gravel and the far-off call of a whippoorwill. Yuki lay on her back, staring at the ceiling boards. The smell of bacon still clung to her hair. In the darkness, she realized that the enemy was not at all what she had been taught. He was not a beast, not a demon. He was a man who fried meat in the morning and wrote careful letters in the evening. A man who locked the gates but gave water freely, who stood guard but did not strike. The thought chilled her more than any threat. Because if the enemy was human, if he could feed her like this, then what had all the killing been for? Outside, the wind shifted, and faintly, so faintly she wondered if she imagined it, she caught the smell again. It drifted through the cracks in the barracks wall, a ghost of the morning. Yuki turned onto her side and shut her eyes, but the smell stayed with her, pulling her forward into a future she could not yet see, a future where the taste of salt and smoke might come to mean something far more dangerous than hunger. Life inside the wire moved with a strange, almost merciful rhythm, as though someone had wound the war down to half speed. Mornings began with the whistle, sharp as a blade cutting through dreams. The women rose from their cots in near silence, adjusting the coarse blankets, tucking them square as they had been shown. The barracks always smelled faintly of pine boards and the iron tang of the stoves that glowed through the night. Yuki learned the sound of the guards' boots before she learned their words. Gravel crunched, doors banged open, and the day began. They were counted first, every head and every name cross-checked against the list. Then came the march to the mess hall. By the third morning, the smell no longer startled her, but it never stopped pulling at her. The cooks served the same fare, bread, beans, bacon, coffee, and every day she sat at the same table near the wall with Aiko, the youngest among them, who still whispered prayers over her food before eating. Aiko reminded Yuki of her little sister, which made it both comforting and painful to sit with her. Aiko was quick to smile, her dark hair always coming loose from its tie, her fingers delicate as a bird's claws. She asked questions in a low voice when the guards were out of earshot. How long would they stay here? When would they go home? Whether the Americans would keep feeding them like this? Yuki never had an answer. After breakfast, they were divided into work details. Some washed laundry in big steaming vats, others peeled potatoes until their hands went raw, and a few, including Yuki, were sent to the infirmary to clean. The infirmary surprised her most. It was bright, with white sheets on the beds and polished floors. American soldiers lay there, men with bandaged limbs and fever-bright eyes. She had expected them to spit at her, to call her names, but most ignored her, and one, his leg in a cast, nodded politely when she passed with the mop. Days blurred together like that, the hours measured by meal bells, the sun arcing overhead, the whistle at dusk calling them back to the barracks. There were rules, of course. No shouting, no fighting, no hoarding food. But there was also a quiet kind of order that became almost comforting. Yuki found her body healing from months of hunger. Her skin lost its gray pallor, her hair grew glossy again, and at night, despite herself, she slept deeply. And yet, she could not shake the sense that this ease was dangerous. Each bite of bread felt like a bargain, each night's sleep like a theft from the dead. She saw the same unease on the other women's faces, especially Michiko, the eldest among them, whose sharp cheekbones cast shadows across her face. Michiko spoke little, but when she did, it was with the authority of someone who had lost more than she cared to say. One evening after roll call, Michiko sat beside Yuki on the barracks step. The air was cool, the sky streaked with violet, and the faint smoke of the cookhouse still lingered. "We must not forget," Michiko said quietly, her voice as flat as the horizon. Yuki nodded, though she wasn't sure what they were supposed to remember. The war, their duty, or the taste of hunger that once defined them. Inside the wire, memory felt like both a weapon and a burden. Some of the younger women began to laugh more freely, learning English words from the guards, mimicking their accents to make the others giggle. One of the cooks taught Aiko how to flip pancakes on the griddle, and she returned to the barracks flushed with pride, carrying a plate she had begged from the kitchen. They ate together that night, the pancakes drenched in golden syrup, sticky on their fingers. For a moment, they were not prisoners but girls at a festival. But the next morning brought news that hollowed them out. A Red Cross bulletin posted outside the main building listed cities recently bombed: Tokyo, Nagoya, Kobe. Entire neighborhoods destroyed, thousands dead. The paper flapped lightly in the wind, but its words struck like hammers. Aiko cried openly, her face pressed against her knees. Michiko stood very still, her lips bloodless. Yuki felt the ground sway under her feet. That night the camp was unusually quiet. Even the guards seemed subdued. The women lay on their cots, staring into the darkness, each imagining her own home in flames. Yuki pictured her mother's hands, cracked from farm work, holding a bucket too small to fight the fire. She pictured her brother's thin face, and felt a wave of guilt that she had eaten 3 times that day. From then on, the food seemed heavier. Each meal tasted of ash. Yuki forced herself to eat, knowing she needed her strength, but she began saving scraps of bread in a tin she hid under her cot, as though hoarding them could make up for what her family lacked. A guard found it during inspection one morning and merely shook his head, returning the bread with a shrug. It was an odd moment. He could have punished her, but instead he treated her like a child caught stealing sweets. The mercy unsettled her more than punishment would have. It chipped away at her image of the enemy, leaving her adrift. If they were not monsters, if they were capable of kindness, then the war became harder to understand. Weeks passed, and the seasons shifted subtly. The mornings grew cooler, the pine trees shedding their needles, the wind carrying the first hints of winter. With each passing day, Yuki felt the camp's rhythm sink deeper into her bones. She learned the guards' faces, the cooks' routines, the exact tone of the whistle. She found herself humming American songs under her breath while sweeping the infirmary floors. One afternoon, while rinsing bedpans, she overheard 2 guards talking about Saipan. How hard the fighting had been, how many lives were lost. The younger guard shook his head and said, "Hell of a thing." His voice held no hatred, only weariness. Yuki gripped the rim of the pan until her knuckles turned white. Hell of a thing. That was all it was to him, the battle that had taken so many of her comrades. She wanted to shout at him, to tell him about the wounded men screaming for water, about the mothers clutching their children on the cliffs. But she said nothing. She rinsed the pan and set it aside, her face calm. That night she dreamed of the beach again, the grenade in her hand, the choice she had not made. When she woke, sweat plastered her hair to her forehead, and the barracks was filled with the smell of bacon drifting from the mess hall. The smell should have comforted her, but instead it felt like a reminder. The war was not over, not for her, not for any of them. Somewhere beyond the wire, beyond the pine trees, the world was still burning. And soon, she sensed, the fire would reach even here. The first snow fell like sifted flour over the camp, dusting the barbed wire in white lace and muting the crunch of boots on the frozen ground. Yuki stood outside the barracks, breath curling in front of her face, and for a moment it felt like home. Except home was a world away, and on this side of the Pacific, the air smelled of wood smoke and bacon. Snow on the wire made everything look gentler, but it could not hide the towers, the guards, or the rifles glinting coldly in the light. Inside the mess hall, the contrast was even sharper. The stoves burned hot, the smell of frying fat stronger than ever, and the food, thick stews, buttered potatoes, meat, steamed on the trays. By now Yuki had learned to line up, to hold her tray steady, to accept whatever was ladled onto it without looking startled. But the abundance still unsettled her. The Americans seemed determined to feed them into forgetting who they were. Aiko, whose cheeks had filled out from regular meals, whispered that morning that she could smell cinnamon in the air. Sure enough, the cooks brought out something new, round pastries glazed in sugar. The women exchanged wary glances. Aiko bit hers first, and her face lit up in shock. "Sweet," she murmured, as if such a thing were impossible in a place like this. Even Yuki had to smile at that. But the sweetness came with a bitter edge. Letters from Japan trickled in, censored and delayed, carrying grim news. Yuki read one by the stove, her hands trembling. Her village had been bombed. The schoolhouse where she had once played nurse to scrape-knee children was gone, her family scattered to relatives in the mountains. She folded the letter carefully, slid it into her pocket, and went back to work in the infirmary, her face like carved wood. It was there, among the antiseptic and the smell of carbolic soap, that the strangeness of her situation deepened. American doctors passed her with curt nods, sometimes even smiles. Once, when a feverish soldier cried out in pain, an army nurse beckoned her closer and pressed a basin into her hands. Yuki held it steady while the man vomited, then wiped his mouth as gently as she would have for one of her own. The nurse said, "Good work," and Yuki felt the words settle on her like snow, unexpected, almost weightless, yet impossible to shake off. After that, she found herself working harder, not out of fear but from something perilously close to pride. She cleaned floors until they shone, boiled bandages, sorted medicine bottles until they were lined up like soldiers. And with each passing day, the the line between prisoner and caretaker blurred just a little more. The irony was inescapable. Here she was, a prisoner of war, helping to heal the enemy. At night, she lay awake listening to the others breathe, wondering if this was treachery or survival. Michiko thought it was dangerous. "Do not forget who you are," she warned, her voice sharp. "Do not let them make you soft." But Aiko was already softening. She had begun to chatter with one of the cooks, a freckled boy barely older than she was, who taught her English words for foods: milk, bread, sugar. The sound of her laughter made the others both smile and ache. It was hard to stay angry when the camp seemed to conspire against despair. Outside the wire, America was at war, but inside the camp there were small mercies everywhere. Concerts put on by prisoners, lectures from professors captured in the Pacific, even a Christmas tree erected in the main hall, strung with paper chains. The women gathered around it, some curious, some offended. The guards sang carols in low, warm voices, and for a moment the whole camp seemed suspended between two worlds. Then, in January, news of further bombings reached them: Osaka, Yokohama, Nagoya again. The destruction was unimaginable, and yet they imagined it anyway. Aiko's smile faltered. Michiko went silent altogether. Yuki felt the ground under her heart split wide open. The camp, with its warm stoves and hot meals, now seemed almost cruel. Each mouthful of food became a reminder that somewhere children were starving. The Americans, perhaps sensing the tension, became oddly gentler. One guard brought oranges to the barracks, bright as lanterns against the winter gray. When he handed one to Yuki, she hesitated, then accepted it with both hands. The peel came away in a single coil, and the smell, sharp, clean, sunlit, made her throat tighten. She shared it with Aiko, the two of them eating slowly, segment by segment, until their fingers were sticky and their hearts ached with something that was not quite gratitude, not quite grief. One afternoon, while scrubbing floors in the infirmary, Yuki overheard a conversation between two officers about Japan's worsening situation. The older man said, almost casually, "Won't be long now." Yuki froze, the mop dripping in her hands. Not long until what? Until surrender? Until destruction so complete there would be nothing left to return to? She wrung out the mop and kept cleaning, but the words stayed with her like a splinter under the skin. That night, the women gathered close in the barracks, the air heavy with unspoken fear. Michiko finally spoke. "If our country falls," she said, "then we must decide what we will become." No one answered her. Outside, snow fell again, blanketing the yard, softening the wire, as though trying to hush the world. And yet the smell of bacon came with the dawn, as if nothing had changed. Yuki stood in line at the mess hall, tray in hand, but this time she could not bring herself to take the strips. She let them slide back into the pan, ignoring the cook's raised eyebrows. The hunger burned in her stomach all day, but she felt oddly righteous, as if she had refused a bribe. Still, by evening the hunger gnawed too sharply, and when Aiko pressed half a slice of bread into her hand, Yuki ate it in 3 bites. The bread was warm, and it filled her with both shame and relief. The next morning, as they marched to roll call, Yuki noticed something strange. The guards seemed more alert, their rifles slung a little higher, their voices clipped. At the far end of the yard, a truck had arrived, its engine still running, exhaust puffing white into the cold. Men unloaded crates marked with stenciled black letters. One of the guards caught Yuki staring and barked an order to move along. She did, but not before she saw what was stamped on the side of the nearest crate: new rations. The words made her pulse quicken. Whatever was coming, it would change the camp's rhythm once again. And this time, Yuki felt, the change would not be gentle. The numbers told one story, but the faces told another. By the winter of 1945, more than 4,000 Japanese prisoners were scattered across camps in the American heartland, and among them, only a few hundred were women. Their presence was so unusual that the War Department kept careful files, pages noting age, occupation, condition of health. Yuki learned of this only later, but she felt the weight of being counted, weighed, classified each morning. It was strange to be turned into a statistic, as if she were less a person than a record of war. And yet, in the evenings, when the guards relaxed and the women whispered in their bunks, it was impossible to forget that they were flesh and blood, that every number had a heartbeat. The Red Cross brought packages sometimes, soap, writing paper, even chocolate. Aiko's eyes had gone wide the first time she tasted the candy, holding the square in her mouth until it melted away, her face soft with wonder. Yuki watched her with something like envy. She wished she could feel that same innocent joy, but the chocolate only reminded her of the factories back home. Now rubble, the workers buried beneath twisted beams. Letters from Japan continued to trickle in, and with them came a new weight. One afternoon, a guard handed Yuki a folded slip stamped with the censor's seal. She unfolded it with shaking fingers. Her mother was alive, but had moved to the mountains to escape the bombings. Her brother had been conscripted. No mention of her father. She read the lines again and again until they blurred, then tucked the paper under her pillow like a talisman. That night she dreamed of home and woke with her face wet. The camp's records might have noted that she was in good health, that she was gaining weight, that her behavior was compliant. But no record could have measured the guilt growing in her chest. She was safe. She was fed. And her country was starving. It was not just her. Michiko's hair had begun to silver at the temples, yet her frame was filling out, her cheekbones softening. The younger women's laughter carried farther each night, their voices bright as if they had forgotten that the world outside was burning. The Americans noticed, too. One lieutenant remarked in passing that the Japanese prisoners were looking positively robust. The word stung. Yet there were moments of connection that unsettled her even more. One day, in the infirmary, Yuki tended to a soldier with a shattered arm. He was young, younger even than her brother, his freckles standing out against his pale, feverish face. When she changed his bandage, he muttered something. Thanks, she thought, and for a moment she wanted to weep. This boy had probably fought on the same island where her comrades had died. He might have shot men she had treated only hours before their deaths. And yet here she was, smoothing the blanket over him, as if he were one of her own. Testimonies from the women began to form a quiet chorus in the camp. Some wrote in diaries, others simply whispered their thoughts under the barracks eaves. Aiko confided that she had started to like the cook who taught her words. He reminds me of my cousin, she said, blushing. Michiko scolded her, saying such thoughts were dangerous, but there was no stopping the slow thaw in Aiko's heart. The guards, for their part, seemed to have softened too. They greeted the women with nods, sometimes even jokes, offering cigarettes or spare buttons for mended coats. The first time Yuki laughed at one of their jokes, she startled herself, clapping a hand over her mouth as if she had betrayed something sacred. But the laugh had been real, and the warmth it left in her chest stayed long after. Camp life became a paradox. They were prisoners, yet their bodies were stronger. They were cut off from their homeland, yet their world was wider than it had ever been. The women began to hold small gatherings in the evenings, singing folk songs from home, sometimes daring to hum American tunes they had heard drifting from the guardhouse radio. The sound was eerie and beautiful, the two cultures colliding in melody. Spring came, and with it a flood of rumors. Germany was near surrender, someone said. The war in Europe would soon be over, someone else whispered. But that only meant the full weight of the Allies could turn toward Japan. The women felt the tension coiling tighter each day. One evening, a rumor swept through the barracks that a new kind of bomb had been tested, something powerful enough to level a whole city. No one knew if it was true, but the fear spread like wildfire. It was around this time that Yuki was asked to speak into a microphone. An American officer approached her after work detail, his tone polite but firm. They wanted her to record a message for Japanese soldiers, telling them they would be treated well if they surrendered. She hesitated, feeling Michiko's eyes on her, sharp as blades. To say such words would be treachery. And yet, she remembered the boy in the infirmary, the one who had thanked her through his fever. She remembered the oranges, the bread, the quiet mercy. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but something inside her cracked. Afterward, she sat on the steps of the barracks, staring at her hands. They were clean, the nails trimmed, the skin smooth again. These were not the hands of a soldier's nurse anymore. They were the hands of a survivor. And survival, she realized, was its own battlefield. That night a storm rolled over the camp, lightning flashing white against the wire, thunder rattling the windows. Yuki lay awake, counting the seconds between flashes and crashes, her heart beating in time with the storm. When the rain came, it beat hard on the roof, and she thought of the sound of bombs on the homeland, of roofs caving in, of fire racing through streets. In the morning, puddles glistened across the yard, reflecting the sky. The camp was quiet, eerily so, as though everyone was holding their breath. At roll call, the guards seemed grim. One of them read out a list of names, women who were to pack their things at once. Yuki's name was among them. Aiko clutched her hand, wide-eyed. "Where are they sending us?" she whispered. Yuki did not answer. Her stomach tightened, and the smell of bacon from the mess hall made her want to retch. Whatever lay beyond the wire now, it would not be the same as before. The war was coming closer, and for the first time since her capture, she feared that safety had run out. The truck jolted as it crossed the dirt road, and Yuki gripped the wooden bench to steady herself. Around her, the women sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces pale in the dawn light, their breaths clouding the cold air. No one spoke. The camp shrank behind them, its towers fading into silhouettes, the wire now nothing more than a black thread against the horizon. For months they had dreamed of leaving, yet now every mile carried them into a new and shapeless fear. They arrived at the rail depot by mid-morning, where a long line of boxcars waited. Armed guards directed them aboard, their movements brisk but not cruel. Inside, the car smelled of hay and old wood, and they sat on the floor as the doors slid shut, leaving only thin stripes of light. The train began to move, slow at first, then faster, the wheels clattering like a drumbeat. Yuki leaned her head against the wall and tried to imagine where they were going. Somewhere inland, they said. Somewhere safer. But safer for whom? Hours passed, broken only by the rattle of canteens and the soft murmur of prayers. Aiko dozed against Yuki's shoulder, her small frame shivering despite the blanket wrapped around her. Michiko sat opposite, her back straight, eyes narrowed as if she could will the train to stop through sheer force. When the sun began to set, a guard slid the door open and passed in a crate of rations, bread, apples, tins of meat. The smell of the meat rose instantly, rich and heavy, and for a moment Yuki's hunger was stronger than her fear. She broke the bread carefully, sharing with Aiko, chewing slowly as though each bite might be her last. Night fell, and with it came the first distant glimpse of fire. On the horizon, faint and red, the glow pulsed like a heartbeat. Someone whispered that it was a refinery, but Yuki knew better. She had seen that glow before on Saipan, when the oil dumps went up and turned the sky to hell. Aiko buried her face against her arm. Michiko shut her eyes. No one spoke again until dawn. When the train finally stopped, it was in a place that looked almost unreal. Rolling fields, neat fences, a wide sky painted with the pale gold of morning. The new camp was smaller, quieter, with fewer prisoners. The air was sharper, carrying the smell of spring grass. Yet something in the atmosphere was tense, expectant. The guards were alert, their rifles always in sight, and the women sensed that news from the outside world was drawing closer every day. One afternoon, while helping scrub the barracks floor, Yuki heard a guard's radio crackle to life. The words were faint, but she caught enough: bombing, surrender, Tokyo, unconditional. The mop froze in her hands. She turned to the others, her lips forming the word surrender, but no sound came out. That night the camp was restless. Some women wept, others stared at the ceiling in silence. Michiko gathered them in a circle, her face carved from stone. "If this is true," she said, "then everything we were taught has ended. The emperor will speak. Japan will bow." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for the first time Yuki saw tears glint in her eyes. The next morning, the guards assembled everyone in the yard. An officer stood before them and read an announcement. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The words fell like stones, each one heavy enough to bruise. Some women collapsed, others pressed their hands over their mouths. Aiko clung to Yuki's sleeve, whispering, "We can go home," but the words sounded hollow. In the days that followed, the camp changed. The guards were almost gentle now, their voices softer, their posture relaxed. Paperwork was filed, ships prepared, names checked off lists. The women packed what little they owned: letters, scraps of paper, tiny carved trinkets made during long nights. Yuki sat on her cot the last evening, looking at her hands. They were stronger now, but not the same. These were the hands of someone who had crossed a line she could never uncross. When the day came to leave, the camp gates opened, and the women filed out one by one. Yuki stepped through last. She glanced back at the barracks, the yard, the kitchen from which the smell of bacon had first reached her. The memory came so vividly she could almost hear the crackle, almost taste the salt. She had hated it once, loved it once, feared it once. Now it was something else entirely, a symbol of the strange, impossible truth that even in captivity she had lived. The ship that took them across the Pacific pitched and rolled, but Yuki barely noticed. She stood at the rail most nights, the wind tearing at her hair, watching the dark water churn below. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay a Japan she no longer recognized, and she wondered whether she would recognize herself there. As the first gray smudge of land appeared, Aiko gripped her hand and whispered, It smells different already. Yuki nodded, but she could still smell the ghost of bacon, faint and stubborn, clinging to her memory. She knew it would follow her forever, a reminder that survival was not simple, that mercy could taste as heavy as guilt, and that even in the center of war, there were moments when life insisted on feeding you. The ship's horn bellowed, long and low, and the women pressed closer to the rail. The shoreline grew sharper, the mountains rising beyond it like watchful sentinels. Yuki straightened her back and tightened her grip on Aiko's hand. Whatever waited there, grief, ruin, rebuilding, she would meet it with open eyes. For just a moment, as the ship slid toward the harbor, she thought she smelled it again, carried on the sea wind, smoke, salt, fat sizzling on a morning griddle. It made her chest ache, but it also made her smile. The world beyond the wire was waiting, but so was she. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.